My theme this evening is education, social development, and community in restoring the moral center. I think it's a safe enough theme that I wouldn't get in the usual trouble in which I get after speaking in Parliament. I have to say that we have the most optimistic of people, because here we are in an anti-corruption conference with the theme implementing key initiatives now, and with a faculty of speakers and an audience without the politicians. Now this is a complimentary remark, in fact, because it is only people with hope, it's only people with confidence in themselves and confidence in the future who can transform society for their own betterment, and probably not the politicians. If the few of us don't continue to do what we are doing, then certainly the physical and human environment, which we think can't get worse, will in fact be much worse. Now, I want to take you briefly through the gist of some recent conversations I had with fellow parliamentary colleagues. And I want to do this just to drop a ladder on what we are fighting against when we speak about corruption, at least in our context. And recently, it was the tea break, having some dialogue, and based on how the conversation was going, I said, well, tell me, certainly the approach to governance, note I said governance and not government. Governance is obviously not appealing to the population. So why don't we just step back and reflect on what we are doing wrong? I said every week there appears to be one disaster after another, or one allegation of corruption after another. And of course, right away I got the response, which went something like this: what are you talking about? What is not appealing to the population? It is only detractors making confusion, aided by the media. Now, in my mind at the particular time, which was just about a week or so ago, still had in my mind quite fresh Petrotrin, environmental spill, the landfill fire, and of course what really prompted it was the recent statement in the public health sector, situation in the public health sector. So I was struck by the fact that every time there is a disaster, every time there's a problem, and these situations seem to be frequent, it is ministers who front and call for an investigation. So I continued to talk, and I said, okay, take the recent situation. Well, where was the CEO of the hospital? Where was the chief of staff? Where was the chairman of the regional authority? Why didn't they see it fit to implement an immediate investigation and ensure that the grieving parents had psychological and emotional counseling? Why is it that this basic aspect of healthcare service depended on the minister's initiative? Now, there was concurrence up to a point, and I thought that I would get a response with respect to the delivery of healthcare. But while not in these exact words, I was told, well, ministers have to front these things because it is how politics is. I responded, well, how does politics get into the accountability for death and a major environmental disaster? If ministers are the ones who front everything, isn't that reinforcing continued unacceptable standards in the public service and lack of accountability by public servants? So I was then told, well, you see, Senator Drayton, you have to understand that you are an independent senator. You are not a politician, and you must understand that there's politics in everything. We have constituencies who want to see us, and the media they want answers from us. I said, okay, I admit that I'm from another world, but still, I can't seem to relate what you're telling me. If the people of this country are kicking out governments every 5 years, well, what you're saying doesn't make sense. Now, of course, this scenario was followed by one a little earlier on, conversation earlier on, which arose as a result of the Trinidad and Tobago issued $550 million bond issue on the international market, which I think was sometime in December. And then I was hearing about a $5 billion loan from the Chinese for various projects. So of course I knew what the bond issue was about. I have my own assumptions with respect to the billions for the various projects that they were speaking about. But I continued, I thought I will just enjoy myself if even I knew that I was wasting my time. I said, why then is it that governments wait just before an election, a year before an election, to talk about investment industrial parks, to build roads, to do things that would normally affect the quality of life? And surely the strategy is not working anymore. The remark was, well, that is what people want, you know. And there are things the government must do, politicians must do. Politics is not easy. You have to understand the electorate and politics. My tea break had ended, and my delightful conversation had ended. So I had reflected, what is the real battle against corruption and governance? And it is a real battle that is against a mindset, a warped mindset. And the revolution we need also, apart from the laws, apart from the whistleblowing systems and so on, also lies with education of the next generation of leaders. To do so, we have to strategize now, and time is of essence. You see, in democratic societies, when civil society recognizes that it faces a dilemma with respect to unprincipled leadership, it resolves it at the polls. Now, when the situation becomes a case of musical chairs, and the choice is which option is the least of all evils, then we are living in a very oppressed society. We are, because oppression has various dimensions. Now, if you believe in electoral democracy, then education and other positive interventions must be the liberating options. So I relate these stories because it really takes love for country to do what we are doing, knowing full well that there's a species amongst us whose minds are wired differently. They do not believe that what they're doing is wrong. They do not believe there's an issue with governance. And note again, I said governance. They have one goal, which is to maintain the status quo. They are steeped in old traditional political systems, and from their perspective, we do not understand their realities. We do not appreciate their realities. In other words, the problem is us. So these stories tell us the extent of the challenge to bring about meaningful change. We are dealing with a culture that's endemic. It has spread throughout not only the hierarchy of central governance, which is invasive, it feeds on itself, it is regenerating itself all the time, it is reinforcing a culture of mediocrity, it is reinforcing a lack of accountability, it is reinforcing a state of dependency, which is oppression, and it is reinforcing greed throughout the society. And that helps us to understand the view of the citizens, which the Chief Justice had mentioned in the research that was done. Yes, it's not only here, it's elsewhere. But I don't care about elsewhere, I care about here. The reality is we can't effectively tackle government corruption unless we simultaneously focus on that triumvirate, which is the government, the private sector, the citizens and community, who want public officials because they have been acculturated to believe that public officials would run something. And also, if they want to get something done, they would run something to the politician. So this thing about corruption, it's really challenging. Now, I have a motion before the Senate for the Joint Select Committee to come up with a framework for campaign financing. Now, I did so with the full knowledge that if the mindset isn't changed, if the culture of governance is not changed, then the white-collar career criminals would evade these very campaign financing laws as they get around all the other anti-corruption laws. So there has to be other interventions, and that is why I'm grateful for this particular theme, which focuses on the social aspect of it, which focuses on education. And it was said earlier on, I think it was by Dian Abdul, that there's a symbiotic relationship between the government, the private sector, and citizens. And the private sector, let us understand, this is no less corrupt than the government. And I think we have heard that today. But the private sector delivers double blows. When they pad contracts to bribe officials, or when they finance campaigns, they then gorge on the consumer because they have profit margins to maintain. So somebody has to pay for it. And then what happens? The same customer who is the taxpayer got to pay to bail out the HCUs and the CLICOs. So the private sector gives you a double whammy. We have had an excellent presentation today from Maura McDavid on uncompromising law enforcement. But the crimes of fraud, money laundering, insider trading, and the range of what are in effect blood crimes, but are whitewashed as an elitist crime, would never be prosecuted with the mindset that I mentioned earlier. To prosecute these criminals means that you are cutting off the flow of the campaign finance dollars, you are blowing the cap on money laundering and tainted money. So the private sector, I heard somebody use the word vampires, are protected. And the politician is protected, hence Section 34. And the umpteen commissions of inquiries in the past 50 years, which yield reports and recommendations, and that is where the stories ended. Now, we need a truly independent anti-corruption agency, because there's really no power distance between the very people that I'm speaking about and those very agencies. And like the billions we have ciphered off in corruption, millions are wasted on the corruption of inquiries, since the public politicians, they pat themselves on the back for having implemented such inquiries, but then do they implement? No. So, and that is another form of corruption that we are paying for. That is equally corrupt. So it's not only campaign finance generated corruption, there are also other major aspects, and I want to run through very quickly. I'm an educator, and in every one of my courses, I deliberately include a whole module on ethics, simply because what is unethical and clearly wrong is not always illegal. How often have we heard in the past few years from leaders in business and government that he or she did nothing illegal, so what is all the fuss about? So you have somebody who has been involved in CLICO via CMNB, and the governor of the central bank sees absolutely nothing but making him his advisor. And there's nothing illegal about it. And only this morning I read in the newspapers this statement from none other than the chairman of the First Citizens Bank, since in a newspaper report of a telephone interview, and that may be subject to correction, but I want to just quote what the paper said. No regulatory rules were broken when First Citizens Senior Executive Philip Rahman purchased 659,588 shares during the States Bank's public offering last year. Chairman Alfonso said yesterday. Now remember, this is a state bank. This is a Republic Bank. This is not Coach. This is We Bank. Okay? Now, she goes on, if you can identify to me what rule or regulations were breached, I will be happy to direct the group of internal auditors, even Price Waterhouse forensic auditors, to investigate it, but you cannot use morals and ethics because everyone is different. That's the chairman of First Citizens Bank. So here we have it. A bank dissing ethics, a state bank dissing. Now, of course, if I was in a position, I know what happened to both the chairman and the employee one time, and I have no qualms in saying that publicly. But you have disethics as a basis for assessing an employee's transaction. Nobody said it was illegal. But if citizens, when they applied for share, could only get 15% of what they applied for, and an employee could get 659,588, something has to be wrong. And if it's not legally wrong, it's morally wrong. But it is not shocking, because I have learned over the past 7 years with my students that, when they come into the class after a few case studies on corporate governance and corporate ethics, they come to the realization that they did not understand the concept of ethics, and they did not know many of the boundary lines. And you're right, because a bribery is a commission. It's not a bribery. So this discussion goes to the heart of why education is critical. I'll be quick. I just want to raise a few things that the students would call me and tell me afterwards. And these range from unethical advertising, the sale of financial products without proper disclosure of the risk factors, breaches in health and safety rules, employers who deduct tax from salaries but do not pay the tax to Inland Revenue. One student called me. He had this dilemma. For 2 years, he has been asking his employer about the TD1. The TD1 slip that you got to put with your declaration? He can't get it. Now, I try, when the students call, I tell them, look, I only facilitate your learning. I cannot get involved in that, because I really don't know the whole story. But nevertheless, I'm human. I asked the student, I said, tell me, are you aware, is it only you who have this problem? He said, no, because my colleagues, we are all talking about it. I said, well, your dilemma is you feel that if you tell him you have to do something about it, you will have a job. He said, yes. I said, well, think about that. He did. And 2 weeks later, he called me. He said, guess what, Mrs. Drayton? I resigned. I said, and you know something? You still have to make the report to the Inland Revenue, and you're now free to do so. So the bottom line is that when you have students calling with respect to ethical dilemmas they face in the workplace, and they tell you, they could give you details of contract padding and fraud, and in the absence of confidential whistleblowing systems, they feel they have no option but to continue to work and stay silent. And this brings me to moral hazard, which is what Derek McCoy, a senior lecturer in the laws of Mona Law School, discussed in his publication, Law, Governance, and Ethics in the Commonwealth, Caribbean. He described moral hazards as a risk involved in the delivery of services when players know they are unlikely to face the consequences of the law for illegal transaction. And I'm sure you've heard that we have never prosecuted, at least that we know, the white-collar criminals. Now, usually the player has some monopoly power over the clients, such as the power relationship between a campaign financer and a politician. But it works both ways, because the contractors are dependent on government for the contracts, and the government is dependent upon them to fly the election campaign. Now, usually, systems to facilitate the accountability and transparency are weak, as they are weak here. So what we have is corruption is equal to monopoly power plus discretion, because there are no proper systems or laws on transparency, minus accountability. So we have corruption. And if we examine all of our laws, those governing the Integrity Commission, the Anti-Corruption Bureau, the Financial Investigation Bureau, the Fraud Squad, Financial Intelligence Unit, as I mentioned, if anybody could show me the distance between the politician and those so-called independent institutions, I really will be happy, because the FIU reports into the Minister of Finance. So it's not just a question of institutions not speaking to each other. I'm not sure that they can speak to each other. In any event, the state has discretion in the appointment of most heads of these institutions, and monopoly power operates in other insidious ways. So said Derek McCoy, for any anti-corruption regime to be successful, it must of necessity also set out to reduce the moral hazard of corrupt behavior and have real power in law. And these laws need to be re-examined because they're weak when it comes to the accountability of the very independent institutions as well as state officials. But in quickly wrapping up, let me say that I leave my students with this to ponder, and you may ponder it. I still have faith in the judicial system, but the more the moral center collapses, the more skeptical I become. So I say to them, obedience to the law is a minimum standard. Reflect on it. Obeying the law is a minimum standard. After all, we rely on people with integrity to enforce the law. So there's a higher order of lawmaking. And this is what first citizens don't understand. It's called integrity and a code of ethics. So when my students then call me and they say, well, I have now met with my boss, or I have instituted a new policy or put a new system, and I've done this, I feel that something is being accomplished. So that I want to say, it brings me quickly to another conversation I had with the head of a tertiary level institution. And it was an exciting conversation about the fact that we spend billions in education, millions in GATE, and we are not seeing the changes in the culture of leadership and governance. Also, we are not seeing the impact on corruption. So the conclusion we came to was that there's little we can do about the top leadership right now. There's little we can do about that. They're steeped in their ways. But if we could get in the classroom on a regular basis, the layers of management just below them, and we could impact even 10, 15, 20% of each class, if we could infect them with the ethical aspects of governance and management, I think we are going to see change. But time is of essence. Let me say that there is something frightening about societies when there appears to be no moral compass guiding leadership performance, and the private sector campaign financiers who do so to peddle influence and power. I'm not saying there's any wrong in supporting whichever government. That is my right. That is your democratic right. That's enshrined in the Constitution. But when it is done in such a way to peddle influence and power, those private sector players become the standard bearers in a supply chain. And the links in the chain, it starts with the political regimes, the corrupt private sector individuals, the regulators who are not independent, and who in effect operate under the thumbs of the policymakers. And the very institutions of checks and balances are peeled away. Corruption does not happen by VAPs. There's reflection on the part of career criminals, and then there's action. There are plots. There are clear, rational strategies to gain power and influence. And the cancer of corrupt government contracts have crowded out, or is crowding out, entrepreneurship. If we remove the energy sector from the equation, if we examine what is left, your relatively large banks, large multinational organizations, about 4 or 5 of them, and some light manufacturing, then the prospects for the future seems a bit discouraging. It is also crowding out conscientious employees. They're looking to migrate because there's hiring of political appointees on contracts or as advisors in key positions who then become the gatekeepers in the value chain of corruption. We have to push back with every effort, including the campaign financing, yes, the procurement laws, yes, the whistleblowing systems, yes, the transformation of the justice system. Education underscores all of these things. And let me say, with respect to the community aspect of this theme, you know, the first question deals with leadership skills needed at the community level to empower citizens. And the first challenge is to identify community and identify a community. In our context, in the context of this conference, it is the value of each individual within a given space. And what are the spaces we have? We have some great spaces. We have the university and other tertiary level associations. We have professional associations, including the Law Association. We have the Chamber of Commerce, Bankers Association, and other financial associations. We have the media associations. We have the cooperative society. We have the manufacturing associations. We have the energy sector. We have the trade union movement. A lot of social associations and civil society groups that are specific and well-defined communities.